Welcome to Canada. Over the next two presentations, which will be separated by a little time, we're going to travel from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. We will go from Newfoundland all the way to Vancouver Island in British Columbia. Carol and I have traveled across Canada, and I have on official business been to Ottawa and other parts of Canada many times. I also have a family connection to Canada, which I will explain later. For the first session, we will begin in Newfoundland and travel westward to the eastern part of Ontario. The next session that we'll do, we will begin in Western Ontario and move across to British Columbia. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few things about Canada in general. Canada is a big country. It has the longest coastline in the world, longer than Russia. 151,000 miles. Half of Canada is covered in forests. Canada has two official languages, English and French. While most of the country speaks English, particularly those in the western provinces, and they get frustrated because all their documentation, both on the national level and on the individual provincial level, provinces, has to be written in both English and in French. In terms of area, Canada is much larger than the United States. It is, in fact, the second largest country in the world, but it has a relatively small population, 37 million citizens. Most of its population live in large cities, and 90% live within 100 miles of the United States border. You can see the percent where the density of populations are by looking at the colors. The darker colors mean more population, and as you get to more of the lighter browns and tans, they mean even less population. One of the striking facts about Canada is almost 1/2 of its current population was not born in Canada. For many years, I would go to Ottawa, the capital of Canada, and notice that the trees were not big, both in diameter and in height. I attributed that to a shorter growing season being further north. But I would later find out that was only part of the reason. The main reason is that most of eastern Canada, and almost all the way out into central Canada, sits atop what is called the Canadian Shield. The shield is depicted in red, sometimes in darker red, mostly around Hudson Bay. It is molten rock that came deep from the earth and sits just either below the surface of the land or sometimes above the land. At best, in most of this area, dirt is only maybe a foot deep. It is not a place for deep-rooted vegetation. But because of the molten elements of earth coming to the surface, it is a place rich in minerals. gold, uranium, iron ore, diamonds, and lots of other minerals. We'll begin our journey today in the far eastern part of Canada. These provinces out this way are known as the Maritime Provinces. The Maritime Provinces being Nova Scotia, Labrador, Prince Edward Island, better known as PEI, and New Brunswick. I have to admit up front that I have not spent a lot of time on the ground in Nova Scotia and in Labrador. I would really like it if somebody here at Carroll Lutheran has toured that area and would do a presentation on both of them. I have flown over both Labrador and Nova Scotia many, many times. And I do have a Scottish family connection with Labrador. During World War II, one of my Scottish family members was a captain of a ship going between Canada and England. It was sunk by submarines, German submarines. After spending a number of days on the open ocean in a life raft, my relative was washed ashore in Labrador. And for the next 9 months until he was rescued, he was nursed back to health by people who in Canada are called the First People. We call them Native Americans. I like the term First People. He often said to me, if it wasn't for their care, he would have died. This is on the coast of Labrador. I have vivid memories flying over Labrador and wishing I could tour, but there aren't very many roads and ways to get access to Labrador. But I have vivid memories of seeing sea ice piling up on the shore. And as the winter progressed, those piles of ice would get higher and higher, and sometimes very high. I am very familiar with the first place we will visit, Newfoundland. Newfoundland is a place that has a close relationship with the United States. While I was in the Navy, it hosted a naval air station, which was critical, absolutely critical, to the defense of the United States. It is a beautiful island. We're going to visit 3 locations on the island. The square or rectangle, orange rectangle, up to the left are the fjords on the west coast. The capital is St. John's, and it's down there to the right with the circle. And then we're going to visit a very, very special place to me and to many, many Americans, Gander. Like Labrador, Newfoundland has some pretty rugged coastlines, but they are both beautiful as well as being rugged. The west coast of Newfoundland has several very, very deep fjords. So deep, a submarine could hide in there. This is the capital of Newfoundland. Folks on the island, as well as around Canada, don't call them Newfoundlanders. They call them Newfies. And they like that name. St. John's has a beautiful harbor, which a lot of tour boats stop at. In many of Carol and my travels, we have noted the farther north in latitude one goes, the brighter of the color of houses. St. John's is no exception. I dare you not to keep your eyes open looking at those colors of the homes. This is the airport at Gander, Newfoundland. And it's key, let me emphasize, it's absolutely key to the safety of everyone flying across the North Atlantic. You may or may not be aware, but crews on those planes flying across the Atlantic stay in touch with physicians located in their company's office. Should a passenger become critically ill in flight, they will direct the plane to land at Gander for medical treatment. I cannot tell you the number of times I have been diverted to Gander because of a sick passenger or aircraft engine problems. A number of U.S. citizens, Gander holds a special place in their hearts. You may remember that on 9/11, planes in the air were told to immediately land, and they were not allowed to fly for several days. 37 jumbo jets landed at Gander Airport with close to 11,000 passengers. The city of Gander is home to only 10,000 residents. What happened when all those planes landed is called the miracle at Gander. Businesses, schools were closed. Restaurants and families immediately started cooking. Passengers were put up in homes and schools and offices. Every need of the passengers was met with never a question as to who was going to foot the bill. In the end, the residents of Gander paid for everything, and they never asked the airlines or the United States for any money in return. Although they did not ask, some of their children became a beneficiary of their kindness. There are a number of stories about the kindness in Gander, but I'd like to tell you one on how that kindness was repaid. When a Delta flight going from London to Atlanta stopped and spent several days there, when the passengers got back on board, a gentleman in first class got on the speaker and suggested perhaps money could be collected to be put into a fund for college scholarships for students at the Gander High School. After all, it was the Gander High School students that took them on tours, that spent the night with them, that saw to all their needs. After the flight, he got in touch with Delta Airlines and several other airlines that had passengers stranded in Newfoundland and got them to contribute to the fund. To date, 163 Gander High School graduates have had their full tuition cost paid at U.S. colleges by the fund. But the fund keeps giving. Today there is over $1 million still in the fund to continue to give scholarships to students. 11,000 people needing to be fed. Breakfast, lunch, dinner for several days. No one went hungry. The population did everything to make sure people's dietary needs were met. Not all passengers were lucky enough to sleep in residence houses. Some had to sleep in the high school gyms and the elementary gym. But as I said, the high school students stayed up all night to make sure people didn't have a problem. During the day, the buses, the high school buses and all the school buses took people on tours of the island, made sure they weren't sitting thinking about their particular issue. They distracted them by keeping them busy. Gander has a 9/11 memorial, and it includes girders from the World Trade Center. I've spent a lot of time in Canada, and my experience is that Canadians love the United States. And sometimes it shocks me how much they know more about the United States than we know about them. We now leave Gander and come across the water to some of the other maritime provinces. We will not be visiting Nova Scotia. I hope somebody can step up and give us a good tour of Nova Scotia. We will be visiting Prince Edward Island and New Brunswick. Prince Edward Island, most times you'll see it written as PEI. Around that dashed line is Prince Edward Island. To the north is the Gulf of St. Lawrence. To the south, in between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, is the Northumberland Strait. The island contains numerous streams, bays, and tidal estuaries. It has a very irregular coast, as you can see by this map. On the north side, the bays are generally blocked by dunes, but on the east and south, there are good natural harbors. Surprisingly, the province has over 1,000 miles of shoreline. Red sandstone cliffs average between 20 feet to some as high as 50 feet. No spot on the island is more than 10 miles from salt water. Prior to 1997, the principal way of getting to the island was to take a ferry. But in 1997, the Confederation Bridge opened, joining PEI to New Brunswick. The 8-mile-long bridge takes about 12 minutes to cross and is the world's longest bridge over in the winter ice-covered water. It can get pretty windy going across that bridge, and trucks and trailers are not allowed when the wind gets above 20 miles an hour. In the foreground of this picture at the end of the bridge, there is a memorial off to the left, near one of those buildings, that is dedicated to a number of individuals who died constructing the bridge. But there is also an area that is an area of celebration. Many of the islanders, particularly the islanders we met during our visit, helped build the bridge. No matter how small their job it was, each one is recognized in a plaza of bricks. Each brick has a name of a worker. The piers on which the bridge is built have a unique design so that ice will not form around them and weaken the structure. When ice forms, and it does in the winter, the design causes the ice to push upward and not directly into the pier. As I said, most of the year prior to the building of the bridge, residents would have to take a ferry. But sometimes in the winter, that strait becomes totally covered in ice and the ferry cannot run. When that happened, many residents would get on sleds and go across the ice to the mainland to get supplies. The biggest tourist draw on the island is this green and white house, made famous by the novel Anne of Green Gables, written in 1908 by author Lucy Maud Montgomery. A lot of people think of it as a children's book, or at least a young adult book, but it was really written for all ages. And it has become considered a classic since the mid-20th century. Set in the late 19th century, the novel recounts the adventures of Anne Shirley, an 11-year-old orphan girl. Anne of Green Gables has been translated into 36 languages and sold more than 50 million copies, making it one of the best-selling books worldwide. The book has been adapted into films made for television, movies, and animated live-action television series. If you get Netflix, there's a continuation of that story done by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It has about 20 episodes, and it is absolutely delightful to watch. This is the house in which the book was set. Today, its grounds and the house are considered a Canadian national treasure. Tourists from around the world travel there to relive their memory of the story. The island is more than just a simple house. Maybe not that simple, but it is a place that is wonderful to live and visit, at least for 3 seasons. Besides Anne's house, this is the second most photographed site on the island. Just looking at that picture, it conveys 2 things to me: the beauty of the setting and the connection of the island to commercial fishing, which is very much a part of its economy. Carol and I had the pleasure of living on the island for a week and exploring places on the island thanks to some folks that we know. Please sit back over the next couple of slides and enjoy some of the scenery. While a lot of the island does not have forest, when it does, it has beautiful green grasses and fields, and then there's beautiful forest next to it. It has lots of small, idyllic farms. You may look over to the right, you'll see later on how the earth has been raised up into mounds or long channels. And that's because they grow potatoes on the island, and that's where they will grow potatoes at this farm. As I mentioned, the northern part of the island's coastline have majestic cliffs. The red color of the cliffs are due to very high iron content. You'll find high iron content throughout the island. Gives you another view. That is not a fault of the camera. That is how the cliffs look red. We were walking along the shore with one of our hosts, and we found a softball-sized rock that looked very, very different from all the others. It was not red. It was dirty gray and worn away, obviously, from years of tumbling in the surf. It's about the size of a softball. Our host explained to us it was not a local rock. Back in the days of sailing ship, rock was used in the ballast of ships sailing to the island from England. They didn't need the ballast for the return sail, so the rock was dumped offshore. Today, that ballast rock periodically washes up on the shore. I'm happy to say that that rock sits on my desk and I'm looking at it as I record this presentation. The beaches, particularly on the north side of the island, are very, very pretty. Again, they are red in color. But having stepped my foot into the water, I'm going to tell you it is very, very cold. You don't see folks out there swimming on this part of the island. Beyond the ocean is beyond those sand dunes on the north side of the island. But there are wonderful walkways, some of them mats, some of them raised on boards, that go around the sand dunes area and some of the shrubbery areas where you can see lots of natural farm life, or natural wildlife, I should say. They are on these marked walkways because the islanders are very protective of their island and do not want to see it ruined by masses of people walking and destroying the shrubbery or the vegetation of the island. During our stay, we did not stay in the large town, which we'll go to in a bit, Charlottetown. We stayed in another town called Summerside. I wanted to just show you some of the houses along the shore there in Summerside. It was a nice place to come back to at the end of the day, a nice town to walk around and just relax. Across from where we were staying is the College of Piping. We were very lucky to be there in the fall when the college was just starting. And lo and behold, one evening when we were there, there was a concert and a lecture, and we very much enjoyed it. While tourism is a large part of the economy, and by the way, that's the bridge that I pointed out earlier in the background. What you're seeing being grown in the foreground are potatoes. They make French fries out of them, but 40% of the potato crop is exported as seed potatoes to grow potatoes in other parts of the world. A big industry on the island is raising mussels, shellfish, to be sold worldwide. They are raised in the numerous bays, and the way I can best describe them, you have these floats, but below these floats are long like socks, maybe about 3 inches in diameter, and they expand. And they put the beginning of the mussel in there, and over time it grows, especially with the tides coming in and out, bringing nutrients to the mussels. And when they get to a certain size, they go out with these boats and use the crane to lift up those socks and harvest the mussels. This is PEI mussels. I've got to tell you, it's not my favorite food. This is the capital of Prince Edward Island, Charlottetown. Has a couple of docks, and perhaps some of you that have toured the area on a cruise may have docked there. What happens is a lot of school buses, and every bus they can find on the island shows up at the cruise ship. Passengers get off and almost immediately go to Anna Green Gables' house, and then they take a couple hour leisurely tour before bringing them back to their cruise ship. It's a whirlwind visit. They get to see some of Prince Edward Island, but they don't get to know the people. And that's what Carol and I always like to do, is know the people. My favorite memory is in this building here, right here, is it was a great place to buy ice cream and then sit out front on one of those benches and eat it. Charlottetown has always been the economic center of the island, and as such, it has some very impressive homes. Note the structure up in the top in between the chimneys. Many of you may be familiar with this from similar designs in New England. It's called the Widow's Walk. It sits on top of the house, has windows all the way around. The wives of fishermen would go up there while they're waiting their husbands and sons to return from the sea. Before we leave the island, I want to share a memory of a visit to a small farm where we met a young couple and their small daughter. Notice that's not discoloration of the photograph, that is actually red soil caused by the high iron content. This is the young daughter with her pig. She just loves that pig. This is a picture of a strange structure. You might be saying, what in heaven's name with this pipe coming out and netting and a bunch of plywood? They are ecological grass cutters. The farmer builds these structures, and then the wife rents them out to homeowners on the island. You get the wooden structure, and you get a chicken. Put the chicken inside, feed it water. The chicken eats grass, and every day or so, you move the structure. You notice there is wheels on the back. Grass gets cut. It is well fertilized by the chicken. In the fall, the wife collects the structures and the chicken. The farmer butchers the chicken, and you get it for your Sunday dinner. I previously mentioned the island is a great place to live 3 out of the 4 seasons. In the winter, it gets a lot of snow. We now move to another maritime province, New Brunswick. It is very famous for the Bay of Fundy, the Blue Arrow, which sits between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. It is famous because it has extreme tides. The cliffs along the New Brunswick side, and that is the Bay of Fundy. The tidal range in the bay, it can go as high as 43 feet at high tide. The average tidal range in the world is 3.3 inches. Because of the tide coming in a funnel-shaped bay, the tides that flow through the channel are very powerful. There is 110 billion tons, not gallons, but tons of water flowing in and out of the bay twice each day. The flow exceeds the combined flow of all of the rivers in the world. Besides being very powerful tidal, the bay teems with wildlife and is a critical habitat for many species of whales and dolphins. There are over 8 species of whales that come to the bay. With the amount of rushing water coming in and out of the bay and going up into the cliffs or in bays, over time it has worn away the rock. You can see where those people are standing when high tide comes in. This will be totally covered in water, and then it rushes out. And over time it has worn away these rocks into this structure. There is a fantastic national park, and it goes for about 48 miles, and it has absolutely fantastic places where you can walk and enjoy the bay. As I say, we were there in early October, and you could walk. Some people might say it's lonely, but you could walk all by yourself because you didn't see anybody else. This is St. John's, New Brunswick. The water going under that bridge to the left It's going up. There is a falls and rapids up that way. And it's known as the Reversing Falls. When the tide comes in, St. John sits on the Bay of Fundy. Water goes up the river, over the falls, over the rapids. And then when the tide comes down, the water comes back down across the falls and down across the river and into the bay. Many places along New Brunswick, you see these very scenic views, buildings, waterfalls, just a gorgeous place to visit. This is a home on an island that is in Canada, in the province of New Brunswick, Canada. It's a few miles from the island to the state of Maine, but the island is still in Canada. It was the former summer home of President Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Campbell Island. When he was in office, many times during the summer, this would become his summer White House. Yes, the summer White House was in Canada. This is some of the typical countryside that you will see, especially as when we were there in October. Very, very picturesque. New Brunswick is the only province in Canada that constitutionally is bilingual. You may say, well, wait a minute, what about Quebec? No. Quebec only speaks French. New Brunswick is bilingual. People speak both English and French. About a third of the population speaks French. The total population in the entire province is less than 700,000 residents. New Brunswick is the world's second largest peat exporter. The red is peat bogs. After the first frost turns them red in the fall. Over 80% of New Brunswick is covered in forests. Over 500,000 Christmas trees are harvested every year in New Brunswick. Most of them are sold in New England to New England states. We move from New Brunswick out along the Bay of St. Lawrence and then the St. Lawrence River to Quebec, Canada. I was going to try welcoming in French, but I decided not to try that. French is the sole language of this province. They are more pure about the using French language than those in France themselves. In France, when you see an international shape of a stop sign, you will also see the word stop. Not in Quebec. This is their word for stop. Before talking about Quebec today, I wanted to share with you and put into perspective some history that I certainly wasn't taught, probably should have been taught in junior high school, but wasn't. So I'd like to share some things with you. Prior to the French and Indian War, by the way, it wasn't a war between the French and the Indians. The French and the Indians fought against the English. This is what Quebec looked like. Everything in purple. You can see parts of Maine, parts of New York, all of Ohio, all the Midwest, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Florida, if you remember, was owned by the Spanish. The dark green in this chart was where the British were. We tend to think they were pushed out with the light green, but they were under British control only in the dark green up till 1750, up to the Revolution. After the French and Indian War, that area in striped green was ceded to England. After the Revolution, most of it became the United States. Some of it became what we know as Canada today. The darker green we know as the Louisiana Purchase. But there's another little story I'd like to share with you that I didn't learn in junior high school. If things had not gone the way they did, if you lived in Vermont today, you would probably be speaking French. Vermont, as a state or as an entity, did not sign the Declaration of Independence. It decided it did not want to become part of the Union. It wanted to become an independent country. After the American Revolution, Vermont realized it could not exist on its own. And it petitioned the Quebec government. We didn't have Canada at the time, we only had the Quebec government, to join in the province of Quebec. I cannot find why, but the Quebec government rejected that petition. And Vermont went on to become the 14th state of the Union. This is Quebec today. The area shaded in yellow. It is the freshwater capital of the world. All those little dots of blue are freshwater. With 10,000 rivers and 3 million bodies of water, Quebec has the world's largest reserve of fresh water, occupying 12% of its surface. You can see where I've outlined St. Lawrence River. The St. Lawrence River and the St. Lawrence Seaway are major shipping lanes of transporting cargo, particularly from Europe to the Midwest of the United States through the Great Lakes. It is a major shipping route. We begin our visit to Quebec and in Quebec City, that is the St. Lawrence River out there. Both sides of the river are part of Quebec. The building on the far left with the copper type roof is one of the most photographed hotels in the world, the Frontenac. Speaking of hotels, about 100,000 visitors pass through the doors of the Ice Hotel, which is built for 2 months every winter in Quebec City. There are dozens of weddings that are celebrated in its chapel. It is built entirely of snow and ice. It is not just a structure, it is a work of art with covering over 42,000 square feet. It is torn down every spring and reinvented every winter. You want to stay there? I warn you, the temperature is a little chilly. It doesn't get above 28 degrees Fahrenheit, but they give you some very nice sleeping bags. Quebec City is very European. It is the only walled city in North America. Note the Canadian flag as well as the Quebec flag. Quebec for many, many years has agitated to be separate from Canada. It wants to be, a number of people in that province want it to be a separate country. In 1995, there was a referendum on independence from Canada. The referendum was defeated by a very, very slim margin. Fewer than 55,000 votes, or 1% of those who voted. Trust me, the thought of independence is still alive within the minds of residents of Quebec. Most of Quebec is fairly rural and in some places rugged, but again, very beautiful. Gets a lot of snow. It's a mecca for those very, very daring skiers. One of the things that we don't sometimes think about, we think about maple syrup coming from New England, but most of maple syrup comes from Canada. 94% of maple syrup produced in Canada comes from Quebec. This is the largest city in Quebec. Quebec City is the capital. This is Montreal. It has over 1 million residents. It is a center for major business of most of the area. Montreal is very close to New York State. So there's a lot of back and forth between Montreal and the state of New York. Montreal is also located on the St. Lawrence River. And I have a story that goes back to 1948. I was born in 1942. My mother had a cousin who I talked about earlier, who his boat was sunk and landed in Labrador. He returned home after the war and again became a captain of a ship. He used to come to Montreal and go, not where this Dayliner or whatever it is ship, but right to this dock in the foreground, and dock and take on grain coming from the Midwest. In 1948, England was still starving, and they were very dependent upon ships coming across the Atlantic with grain. My family would often travel up to Montreal when he would come on one of his trips. One trip, he brought his family, which included 2 daughters. One daughter, if you've heard me talk about my closeness to Scotland, is one of my dearest friends. I consider her to be my sister. She's not my sister, but I consider her to be my sister. Anyway, her other sister was on the boat also. Little did I know, or did my family know, that the other sister had measles. And while my mother and father were out with their father and mother, I stayed in the same room with my two second cousins. I got the measles. And then a major problem occurred. In 1948, if you had the measles, you couldn't come back across the border into the United States. Well, I laid in the back of the car under a blanket, pretending to be asleep when we went across the border. To this day, I have never let my second cousin not remember that she gave me the measles. Montreal is very, very French speaking. It is very French in its culture, but it is also a little American. They love baseball. This is the home of the Montreal Expos baseball stadium. In inclement weather, the top of that dome closes up and you can go ahead and play. But at other times of the year, it opens up, and it even has air conditioning inside. I say folks in Ontario are very, very French, but they like the United States too. They like to drive or fly or take the train to Florida every year. I cannot tell you the number of people that migrate, particularly to the west coast of Florida during the winter. There are so many folks from Quebec. There are several French language newspapers in Florida. We continue our journey going west. We're going to the province of Ontario. As you'll see, Ontario is a study in contrast. It has a very varied landscape. It has vast and rocky and mineral-rich areas in the Canadian Shield, but it also has fertile farmland in the south and grassy lowlands in the northwest. Physically, it is larger than France and Spain combined. And I will also point out to you that I've got a little blue arrow, which is hard to see, how far south in a southern direction the province goes. It goes almost as far south as we are here in Maryland. And it touches several states. It touches New York State, it touches Ohio, and it touches Michigan, and some other Wisconsin, I should say. It has the largest population of all the provinces in Canada at 13.5 million people. You notice it hugs around the Great Lakes, every one of them except Lake Michigan. In the rural areas of Ontario, it has a large number of mammals: moose, caribou, black bear, polar bears, particularly around Hudson Bay, deer, and wolves. We begin our visit to Ontario again in the St. Lawrence River. It's hard to see with the green, and then you see a number of, they're actually names of islands that are in the St. Lawrence River. This area is known as the Thousand Islands. While it's hard to read on the television, it's a sample of each one of those names is an island. Some of the islands are very small and some are very big. Most have private homes. The bridge you see in the middle of the picture goes from New York State on the right over to Ontario on the left. The border goes straight down the middle of the St. Lawrence River. So some of the islands are in Canada and some are in the United States. And some islands are in both countries. You don't see a fence. You don't see a wall. This is the unprotected border with Canada. This is one of the houses that is on the islands. There are a number of very, very distinct architectural houses. Very, very nice. That'd be a delightful place to just live and spend the summer. We're now going to move from the Thousand Island area along the St. Lawrence, which I have circled in red, or at least ellipsed in red, and we're going to be moving up to Ottawa, the capital of the nation of Canada. Toronto down to the left is the capital of the province of Ontario. Ottawa is located appropriately on the Ottawa River, which is the boundary between the provinces of Quebec and Ontario. In the foreground, where you see that red arrow and those buildings, that is Ontario. Across the river is a portion of Quebec. And across that bridge is a town or a city. And that city is called Hull. It doesn't have a French name. It's Hull, H-U-L-L. It wasn't named after a place in France. It was named after a city in northern England called Hull. The white structure with the little red arrow above it is the U.S. Embassy. The building behind that grassy area is the Canadian Parliament building. The Parliament building is part of that tower you see. There's two towers on the right. The one to the left is part of the Parliament building. But I wanted to call your attention to this building that's also got a green roof and a clock on it. As I mentioned earlier, I used to go to Ottawa fairly frequently. But I would tell you, do not go to Ottawa in January or February. It is bone-chilling cold. One of those meetings was a bilateral meeting with what we call the ABC countries. That's Australia, New Zealand, Britain, Canada, and the United States. And I went up there on a Sunday night with another colleague, and the meeting was supposed to start at 9 o'clock in the morning. And we stayed at a hotel which was about a half-mile walk away from this building. This building is the British High Commissioner building. Technically, it's the British Embassy, but since Canada is part of the British Commonwealth, it can't be called an embassy. Anyway, my colleague and I started walking. We didn't realize that the outdoor temperature was minus 12 degrees and the wind was blowing. By the time we got to the meeting place in this green roof building, we were frozen to death. We entered the door there in front of the building, and we were greeted by a guard who said, "I'm sorry, but the meeting has been delayed till this afternoon. It will convene at 1 o'clock. We said, "Can we stay there to keep warm?" And they said, "Well, we would prefer you did not, because the hosts for your meeting have not arrived." Not wanting to freeze to death, we headed for the Canadian Parliament building. When we got there, we got on a phone and we called the organizers of the meeting, who are my dear friends from the UK or England, and told them, "We're over in the Parliament building. If you want us to come to the meeting, come and get us when you're ready." We were not happy campers. For the rest of the morning, we did have a very warm time. We sat in on their parliamentary discussions. We sat in the chairs up there to the top. I love going to parliaments. The members from each different party, and they'd be on either side of the room, are very, very polite, but their comments are very, very cutting, particularly when they don't agree on a particular bill being put forth by the government. I admire I'm Canadian politicians. My cousin in Scotland would have a heart attack over what I just said before. This has been my impression of Canadians, in particular politicians. I think this is a Canadian politician. He's in their cabinet today. And I think what he said about democracy is very true, and I wish it was the way most of us think. I'll read it to you. Democracy is not about picking winners and losers. When you do, you are thinking of sports or perhaps capitalism. Democracy is about working together to accomplish more than we can do as individuals. It is about bringing all stakeholders to the table so that everyone can get what they need. When democracy functions as it should, we are all winners. This is the Rideau Canal. It connects Ottawa to the St. Lawrence River. If you're there in the summer and late spring and early fall, it is a lovely place to walk, and there are lovely tree-lined areas along the canal. Well, not this boat, but some boats behind it. People rent boats and they sleep on them and cruise up and down the canal during summer months. During the winter, the canal becomes a very long ice skating rink. Some of my friends use it as a means of transportation to their work location. Some of my Canadian government friends, they skate to work along the canal. We're going to bypass Toronto for a minute and come down to the southern end of Lake Ontario, and again with the border with New York State, and a city that many of you are familiar with, Buffalo. We're going to be going to Niagara Falls, which sits right on the border between Ontario and New York State. This is Niagara Falls from the air. There are two parts to the falls. There's the American Falls, which, as I say, sits in New York State, and it is then a little bit of a border with this island called Goat Island to the falls that is the Canadian Falls. You can see the American Falls is much smaller than the Canadian Falls, which is a great big horseshoe shaped. You might be careful if you notice there's a boat down in the river going up to the falls. It's called the Maid of the Mist. You can go in and actually go right into the mist of the falls. Everybody's wearing raincoats. If you really want to see the beauty of the Niagara Falls, you need to go and look at it from the Canadian side. You do not get a good picture of the entire falls from the US side. This falls is known as Horseshoe Falls. You can look down the bottom of the picture and watch they tend to be Americans all standing there looking at the falls. You can also see the Maid of the Mist going in to the mist coming from the falls. "700 gallons of water flows across the falls every second, not minute, every second. As I said, the American Falls is smaller, and this is the viewpoint that you get standing on the New York side. You can see the part of the Canadian Falls there to the right in the distance among the mist. In the winter, the falls has been known, this is the American Falls, has been known to freeze over. My mother and father were married in January, and they went on their honeymoon, which many people did in the 40s, early 40s, to Niagara Falls. And they always said how cold it was, but how interesting it was to see the falls frozen over. In 1996, there were some concerns about the falls on the American side. And so they dammed up the river and let all the water flow through the Canadian Falls. They're shown in the arrow. The water was stopped and inspections were made, and the folks that did it were assured that there would not be a massive break-off of the cliffs that comprise the falls. But this is what the falls looks like when the water is stopped. We're going to leave Niagara Falls, which is over where that yellow arrow is, And I had pointed to you a large stretch of Ontario that goes along Lake Erie and part of Lake Michigan that goes all the way south to Detroit, Michigan. This is the most densely populated area of Canada. Between Toronto and Detroit, it has also the biggest manufacturing area. This is the far end. This is the land at the bottom is Canada. It's Ontario. The land at the top is the United States, better known as Michigan. And if you notice, if you have to go from Canada up to Detroit, you go south. You go north, excuse me. If you're going to go from the United States to Canada, you go south. Totally mind-boggling that you would be going south to go into Canada. This is one of those manufacturing facilities in Ontario. The area between Toronto and Detroit is extremely important to the North American, emphasize North America, Canada and the United States car industry. It has 5 automobile assembly areas and numerous parts manufacturers. It is highly likely that if the car you drive, at least a portion of it was built, if not most of it, in Canada. These are the cars American companies build in Canada for importation into the United States. We're looking from downtown Toronto across Lake Ontario towards New York State. Toronto is the most populous city in Canada, with 2.73 million people and growing. It is the provincial capital of Ontario, and it is the 4th largest city in North America. According to multiple sources that I have read, Toronto is considered the safest metropolitan area in North America. It ranks 4th as the most favorable city in the world to live in terms of safety, public transportation, and cleanliness. To say it sits on Lake Ontario, and it is growing. It is growing by leaps and bounds. It is a center of business, finance, arts, and culture, and it is recognized as one of the most multicultural and cosmopolitan cities in the world. Today, 51% of its residents were not born in Canada. Residents speak over 140 different languages or dialects. Toronto is a place, if you're a foodie, you love it. There are more than 8,000 restaurants in Toronto. You can find one specializing in everything from Caribbean, Chinese, Creole, Indian, Mexican, Middle East, Malaysian, Thai, Polish, Korean, Hungarian, Spanish, French, Italian, Japanese, and many more. One of the nice things is they are building new buildings in Toronto, but they've tried very hard to retain some of the older buildings under a historic trust. You can see these new buildings going up all across the city. But they did something that is unique. It does get hot. Carol and I can attest. We were in Toronto getting ready to take a train, which I'm going to talk about in my next presentation. And it was 95 degrees and the humidity was probably equivalent. It was hot. But the folks that have designed these buildings in Toronto were very smart, as well as the city government. They found an ingenious way to air conditioning the buildings. The bottom of Lake Ontario stays very, very cold, between 50 to 56 degrees. They ran pipes out into the middle of the lake. And they take water from the bottom of the lake, run it in, and use it just like Freon to cool the air conditioning units. They don't need to use compressors to compress the Freon. The water is cold, and then the water is returned to the top of the surface of Lake Ontario. These are some of the many buildings that are being built not only in downtown, but out in the suburbs of Toronto. This might be a hard picture to understand. It's a drawing. Those white cubes and things represent the skyscrapers and part of the buildings that are downtown Toronto. You will see some orange lines and rectangles and so on. There's an arrow saying path pointing to one of those orange lines. In reality, they are underground walkways. They are more than walkways. Path is the largest continuous underground shopping area in North America. In those rectangulars and along some of just those lines, there are over 12,000 stores underground. It is the longest underground walkway, going a total length of 18 miles. It connects 50 office towers, 5 subway stations, 6 hotels, and the major railway terminal. When it's hot outside, it's delightfully cool downstairs in this path walkway. And when it's snowing upstairs, above ground, you never know it. It's not just stores, but there are shopping centers with major department stores located, particularly in those areas defined as rectangles. This is one of those shopping areas. We will be ending this particular presentation in a slide or so. But please join me for the continuation as we continue across Canada, going through Western Ontario, out over the prairies, and until the Canadian Rockies, and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. We're going to do this journey by going into this building. This is the main train station in downtown Toronto. And we're going to be taking a 4-day and 4-night trip across Canada in a 1950s style refurbished train. I'm going to tell you why, not only did I want to see Canada, but why I took this trip in the next presentation. But one of the reasons is my family, when they came to the United States, worked for the New York Central Railroad. So as a kid, I had a pass to go on the railroad across the eastern part of the United States. And we did. I loved going on trains. And so when the chance came to go across Canada on a train, I jumped at it. We're going to be going on a train that looks like this. It's a sleeper, much like we used to call Pullmans. It has observation decks and a great place to see Canada. We left Toronto, went up through Western Ontario, Manitoba, I call it Saskatchewan, Alberta, which I love, and I absolutely adore British Columbia. Carol and I have been there many times, and I'm going to be delighted to introduce you to Vancouver Island if you've never been there. One of my favorite spots in the world. So until next week, or until when the next presentation is shown, please stay safe. I hope to see you around the campus. Looking forward to the day when we can all see each other again in the dining venues. Have a good week.